Hi everyone, so this lab will be focusing on the axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton consists of your skull, which would be up here, your vertebral column that I'm pointing out, back of it, vertebral column, your rib cage, so all your ribs right here, your sternum, and down here, your sacrum. So since we already covered the skull in our last lab, we'll be looking at all the other structures. Just notice that your clavicle and your scapula are part of the appendicular skeleton, not the axial. Okay, so now let's look at each bone and their components, articulated and disarticulated. So let's start off by looking at our vertebral column. So all of this back here, all these vertebrae coming together is your vertebral column. Let's start off with just looking at general features of your vertebral column. So here is a vertebra that's disarticulated. This that I'm holding right here, all of this is your vertebral body. So even in this view, we're looking at our vertebral body. This big hole in the middle is your vertebral foramen. Once we have all of our vertebrae stacked on top of each other, each of this foramen makes a big continuous canal, and that's where your spinal cord goes through. So vertebral foramen. Here we have our transverse processes. So our two transverse processes. Transverse process. This going back here, that's pointed down, and you can see a side view of it, is your spinous process. Here we have our superior articular facet that articulates with the vertebra on top of it. And if we're looking down here, the ones right down here, this would be your inferior articular facet. So let's label everything in this view as well. So here we have our vertebral body, our transverse process, our spinous process, your superior articular facet, and your inferior articular facet. Okay, now you'll also be responsible for knowing whether this is a cervical, thoracic, or lumbar vertebra. So if we look at your cervical vertebrae right here, the cervical vertebrae are a lot smaller and daintier than your thoracic and lumbar. So here, if I show you all three, this is your cervical, this is your thoracic, and this right here in my hand is lumbar. So you can see that cervical is the smallest out of the three, lumbar is the largest out of the three, and you can kind of tell the relative differences in their vertebral body and the sizes of your transverse processes. So let's start breaking them down and looking at each. So here we're looking at your cervical vertebrae. This is the smallest vertebrae. The vertebral body is super small, and the vertebral foramen is larger relative to your vertebral body. The cervical vertebrae also have these transverse foramen that the other vertebrae don't have. And your spinous process right here is kind of daintier, kind of smaller, and some of them you see two little processes coming off at the end. So here we have cervical. Another thing about cervical, before I forget, is that their superior and inferior articular facets have the slanted look. As you can see, it's slanted. right through there. Next, our thoracic vertebrae. So for your thoracic vertebrae, your spinous process is angled downwards and it's super pointed, whereas the cervical right here, it's kind of just pointed out. In thoracic, it's pointed down. Your vertebral body is slightly larger, actually a lot larger than your cervical, and the vertebral foramen and the vertebral body are kind of like equal in size. As you can see right here, this would be cervical, this would be your thoracic. And in your thoracic vertebrae, your superior and inferior articular facets are angled in a line. So whereas in cervical it was slanted, you can see that right here, they're in this line. And your transverse processes are thicker than your cervical. Okay, now for our lumbar. Your lumbar is the biggest, the chunkiest, the largest. The vertebral body is huge. It's huge, and your spinous process isn't really pointed and long. It's just stout and large, just kind of stout and large, but it's not pointed downwards as it was in your thoracic. This is thoracic. Your superior and inferior articular facet, so this would be your superior articular facet. This would be your inferior articular facet. They're making these cup shaped facets. So as you can see right in here, this is a cup but inward. It's an inward cup, and this one is a cup but it's outward. So that's your lumbar vertebrae. Next, we're looking at the sacrum. The sacrum, so this would be your anterior part of the sacrum, and this would be your posterior part of the sacrum. Your posterior part is a lot more bumpy, it's got a lot more edges, whereas your anterior part is a lot more smoother. So for your anterior part of the sacrum, all of this that I'm holding right here would be the ala, or the wings. So all of this would be your ala, or the wings of the sacrum. Here, so I kind of tried to mention this in lecture, but because I don't have the bone, it's a lot harder to do. This point right here, all of this on the anterior side is called the sacral promontory. Sacral promontory. Since we're on the anterior side and we're looking at the sacrum and we have these holes, each of these holes are called the anterior sacral foramen. Anterior sacral foramen. And the lines that are kind of connecting the two foramen right here, you kind of see this line, you see a little bit of this one and this one. Those are called your transverse lines. Your transverse lines. If we look at the posterior side, once again, it's very irregular. We have these facets again in your sacrum, and these are called your superior articular processes. Your superior articular processes. This should be a hole, but it's not in this particular bone, but all of this would be your sacral canal, and this is where the end of your spinal cord is. It's called the cauda equina, the end of your spinal cord. So here would be the end of your spinal cord. And this would be your sacral canal. So we have the superior articular processes, your sacral canal. All of this right here is called your median sacral crest, not medial, median sacral crest. And here, since we're in the back of the sacrum, these would be your posterior sacral foramen. So here we have the anterior sacral foramen. Back here we have the posterior sacral foramen. And this little hole right here that you see is called the sacral hiatus. This is on the inferior side of the posterior sacrum. So this would be your sacral hiatus. Here's another sacrum, but this has the coccyx articulated and attached, whereas the one we just looked at doesn't. So now let's look at your coccyx. So your coccyx has these two, all of this would be your coccyx and this would be your sacrum. So your coccyx has these two transverse processes, those two transverse processes, and it also has these two little horns that you see coming off of the transverse processes. So these horns. So transverse process and these horns. Okay, now let's switch our attention to your rib cage, your thoracic cage. So all of this right here. I'm just gonna move this to the side. Okay, so here we're looking at our sternum and the cartilage that helps the sternum articulate with the ribs right here. So here we're looking at the sternum. The sternum has three parts. All of this is called the manubrium. This first part is the manubrium. The manubrium consists of three notches. This first notch up here is your jugular notch, the jugular notch. And then these two notches on the side are your clavicular notches. See here, the clavicle, that's where the clavicle is articulating with your sternum, the manubrium right there. So clavicular notch and jugular notch of the manubrium. Our second part of the sternum is the body. So all of this right here is the body of the sternum. The body of the sternum has all of these little facets, that articulate with the ribs, and those are called costal facets. So facets right here. This right here, it's called the sternal angle. That's where your manubrium and the body of the sternum are attaching together. So sternal angle. Now for the third part of our sternum, here we have the xiphoid process. See here also, the xiphoid process. Okay, now let's start looking at our ribs. So your rib cage, or your ribs themselves, they consist of your true ribs, your false ribs, and your floating ribs. So these right here, ribs 1 through 7, would be your true ribs, and they each have their own cartilaginous binding structure to the sternum. So they each have their own costal cartilage, 1 through 7. And then you have your false ribs, which kind of attach to a bigger cartilage to attach to the sternum. So they don't have their own cartilage. And then you have your floating ribs. As you can see, this rib right here doesn't really have a cartilage. It's just kind of floating. This little one too. So these would be your floating ribs. Now let's look at a rib by itself. So here I'm looking at a rib, and we have, I'm just gonna move it backwards just to make it easier for y'all to understand. So here we have the head of the rib, the neck of the rib. So head, neck, and then tubercle. Let's look again. See if I can focus on that. So head, the neck, and the tubercle of your rib. And then we have this little groove down here, as you can see right here, and this is your costal groove, your costal groove. So once again, the head, the neck, the tubercle, and your costal groove. Okay, I think that is everything for your axial skeleton.